Richard Hurowitz has written a book entitled In the Garden of the Righteous, The Heroes Who Risked Their Lives to Save Jews During the Holocaust. Richard, what made you decide to want to write this book?
The origin of the book probably originally goes back to when they opened the Holocaust Museum in the United States, which is early 90s. And I was in college at the time, and I went down with my family to see it. And I went through the museum and the exhibit, which hasn't changed actually to this day, although they are in the process, from my understanding, of actually redoing it for the first time since the museum opened. It's a very enervating exhibition. I've spoken to many audiences about the book, and everyone has the same visual memory of a pile of shoes there from all of the victims. And if you look very closely, you see children's shoes, and reminds you that of the 6 million Jews who died, 1.5 million were children. And at the time I was in college, and I found this extremely upsetting. And I came out into a small exhibition at the end that they had of people who tried to do something in rescuers. And I gravitated in particular to a photo of a young guy who was about my age at the time, who was a medical student at the University of Munich. And he was part of a group called the White Rose, who are very well known in Germany today, but are not very well known outside of Germany. And I was very taken by this story about how they had tried to basically foment a student uprising against Hitler. They were very idealistic. They were religious too, but very erudite. They did this by circulating leaflets throughout Germany. They got as far as Austria. This was known at the time outside of Germany. The leaflets would later be used by the British. They parachuted them into Germany, and the leaflets basically talked about how, this was not the Germany that they believed, that everyone believed in, and they were one of the first people to publicize the Holocaust in these leaflets. In any event, the story has a very tragic ending, because they were, after about a year of this, and it was actually starting to drive even Hitler personally crazy, they were caught by a maintenance man at the University of Munich. They were turned in, as happened to many people who tried to do something, and they were summarily executed within days. And actually, Sophie Scholl, who was the young college student who was at the center of this, and when she was tried, she said something like, everybody agrees with us in Germany. They're just afraid to say it, which of course was not true, right? But it's obviously a very inspiring message. I thought about doing my thesis. I was studying history at Yale on them, but I ended up doing something on Alexander the Great. But the story stayed with me, and on the 75th anniversary of the execution of the White Rose, I wrote an article about it for the New York Times. It was sort of a history piece, just telling the story and then talking about what we can learn from them. And it happened to coincide with the student activism on the back of the Parkland shooting. And as these things happen, everything came together, and it went fairly viral. It went to one of the top, the most read stories of the day, and it really, I read the comments. It was all positive, which was unusual, because usually anytime you mention the word Nazi, somebody's going to write something. And I've actually, all of my years of writing about this subject, I've actually never had anybody ever do that, which is pretty remarkable. So then I started writing a series of these for a number of different publications, including the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times, and I had a very similar response. And I also learned through that rescue is a very understudied area of the Holocaust and of history. And yet at the same time, I think they're unbelievably inspiring. They're very important lessons we can learn from these people who are in some ways among the most heroic people in history. So I decided to turn it into a book, and the book is 10 stories of different types of rescue, and a little bit on why people did this and what we can learn from them.
Yeah, it really is an inspiring book, and beautifully written, may I say, and researched, obviously, and some characters that one hadn't heard of, or at least I hadn't heard of before, such as Aristides, de Sousa, Mendes. I'd like you to talk about his story in a moment, but before you do, what a number of rescuers were a tiny, tiny minority, of course, of people in occupied Nazi-occupied Europe. What made people rescue others when so few did? First of all, what percentage would you say it is?
Well, so the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, which is the title of my book, comes from the Garden of the Righteous, which is every time they recognize someone as a righteous among the nations, which is the highest award that the state gives for this. There are about 27,000 people who've been recognized. Now, that's out of a population of Europe at the time of, I think, about 500 million. So one analogy I like to use with, when talking about it is if you, just to visualize it, if you were to fill up a basketball stadium, which usually seats about 20,000 people, with a representative sample of Europe at the time, you would have one person who was a righteous among the nations. So it was about, 1 in 20,000. I think the criteria in Yad Vashem candidly are a little bit too strict. I think there were many people who did things that wouldn't rise to the level of, what that were still pretty heroic. People who gave people food, let them stay overnight. There were also many people that we never know about who did this. A lot of it was clandestine. People died. But even if you multiply by 10 or 100, you're still talking about a very small, less than 1% of the population really did anything to help others. So, they were exceedingly rare. And unfortunately, there wasn't a lot, Andrew, of systematic study that was done in the years after the war for a variety of reasons. And I think part of that is people were very interested in evil. They wanted to know why people either perpetrated crimes or collaborated or just went along with it. So you had the famous Milgram experiments at Yale. You had the Stanford prison experiments where you're sitting. And also a lot of the rescuers were, for a variety of reasons, people didn't, they remained anonymous. Partly out of just modesty. I mean, it's kind of almost spooky. I've read hundreds of testimony, and people use almost the exact same words. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did what a decent person would do. So there was one study that was done by some Freudians, and they concluded that what the difference between people who rescued or didn't had to do with how they were disciplined as a child, which is very Freudian. But I think there is something to that. And so what I can tell you is, having gone through many, many, many cases, I see certain patterns have emerged. One thing, people in creative professions tended to be more likely to help. People in international, for sure, professions, whether it was diplomats or people in international business, people who had colleagues around the world, that was helpful. One thing that was completely not helpful was education. Every attendee at the Wannsee conference had either a PhD or a law degree. And so, if anything, it might have been counter. But I would say two things. One is two things that I would say were almost universal, is that every rescuer generally had something they believed in greater than themselves. It could have been political, it could have been custom. Well, most likely it was religion, and although not every rescuer was religious, but a lot of rescuers tended to be religion, and it was cross-religion. I mean, it was Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, Muslim, because Albania was a majority Muslim country, but it was people who believed in the teachings internally. It wasn't for external displays of piety. I think the parable of the Good Samaritan saved more Jews than anything else during the war. And then the other thing I think that was basically universal is that every rescuer seems to have had, and this goes back to the study I was talking about, early in their childhood, at least one figure, often two, often a parent, but not always, who did a couple of things. One is more obvious than the other. The obvious one is that they exposed them to people different than themselves and said, we don't believe in bigotry. We are tolerant of people different than us. The second thing is that they often came out of loving homes and were supported as children. And this could do, the Freudian study would say they were disciplined in a rational way. But all of this is important because it means that they had a significant amount of self-confidence, which comes out of being in that kind of home. And if you think about it, to be a rescuer in occupied Europe, you really had to have a lot of self-confidence, because first of all, you had to believe not only that your moral compass, you had to believe that your moral compass was correct. You also had to believe that if you took action, you could make a difference. And so like Irena Sendler, who is one of the chapters in my book, who led a network of mostly young women who went saving about 22,000 children and Jewish children and babies from the Warsaw Ghetto. She went back and forth several times a week. It was extraordinarily dangerous. Her father was a doctor who actually died from typhus that he caught from some very impoverished Jews, who told her that if she saw someone drowning, she had to help. And that if she saw someone in jeopardy, right, you had to, and she talked about this later. She talked about this, she lived actually in the end well into her 80s. And when she gave interviews later in her life, she would refer always to her father and this message that she got from him. So I think that was, to the extent there was a secret formula, it all has to do with, I think, early childhood and how you're raised and the values that you're raised around.
What references do any of those criterion have for Aristides de Sousa Mendes? And tell us all about him.
Well, he's people often ask me, who's your favorite? And I shouldn't really say. It's like asking who's your favorite child. But I think if
he was my favorite. He was my favorite too, actually.
He's amazing. Yeah. And actually the Christian Science Monitor called him the breakout star of the book, which I was
I agree.
I agree with
amusing.
That. Yeah,
he is.
So he's an amazing story, and someone who was definitely inspired by both. I think the values he was raised on, and he was also happened to be a devout Catholic. He actually undertook the largest, they believe it was the largest single rescue by an individual during the Holocaust. And yet nobody knows his name. And one of the reasons, to go back to your first question, I decided to write the book is I feel there is a historical injustice that we all know. If you had asked me who was Heinrich Himmler or Hermann Goering, everyone would know who he was. But this man, who's again probably rescued about 10,000 people during 3 weeks, is unknown. And so, but he was a Portuguese diplomat. He had been born when Portugal was still a monarchy, actually, and he was an aristocrat. He was a twin. And both he and his brother went to law school like their father, but then they both decided to go into the Foreign Service. And his brother was sort of one of these diplomats. He had a meteoric career. He became foreign minister. And was exceptionally talented. His brother Aristides was also talented, but he was a different kind of diplomat. He was one of these like bon vivants, and so wherever they sent him all over the world, he was really beloved. He was entertaining constantly, fascinating people. There's stories about Einstein doing math problems with his kids, and his daughter was in a royal wedding in France. And he had 14 children, and they used to fly in his house in Portugal, the flag for everywhere that they were born. And he actually had two of his children were American, so the American flag flew there, and two of his children would actually later be at D-Day. But in any event, he found himself, he was sort of a mid-level diplomat, and he found himself as consul general, which during the war became extraordinarily important because Dorothy Thompson, the journalist, had a very famous line where she said, "We live in a time when pieces of paper decide someone's life." And so but by being consul general, he was basically in charge of visas for people. And he found himself in Bordeaux as the consul general for Portugal. And this was in June of 1940 when the Nazis invaded France. And, at that point, as I'm sure most of your listeners will know, there was there was a massive massive exodus out of Paris south, where you had literally, millions of people in probably one of the worst traffic jams in history. There were horrific scenes of the Luftwaffe, strafing people, and everyone was fleeing south because, that was the Germans were kind of, were in the north, and the hope was also if you could get to the south, you could get out of France. So he's in Bordeaux, and literally, hundreds of thousands of refugees show up. It was a very dramatic scene because actually, the French government in exile came there. De Gaulle was there. The soon-to-be Vichy government was there. Everyone is in Bordeaux. And what's he had been, so just to back up 1 second, Portugal at the time, the dictator of Portugal was Salazar. And Salazar was a sort of very complicated Machiavellian figure who wasn't quite a fascist, didn't believe in political parties. He was a virulent anti-communist. But he was basically a corporatist, but ruthless. And his primary foreign policy goal, because if you think about where Portugal is basically surrounded by Spain, was to keep Spain out of the war. And Franco was, of course, an ally of Hitler and Mussolini. And so the idea that, and was opposed to refugees coming across the Spanish border. Spain was neutral. If you could get to Spain, you were safe. So Salazar was very focused on not having refugees in. And a number of months earlier, he had circulated something called Circular 14, which basically said that nobody was allowed to come into Portugal without getting permission from Lisbon first. There were a few carve-outs, which was Americans, I think British, French if they were famous, which was it was a very, very, very set. But it was very clear that if you did not have they also said specifically not Jews and people without a passport could not come in. So by June of 1940, Sousa Mendes had actually already been reprimanded a couple of times because he had given visas to people because he felt quite sorry for them. One of whom wasn't even Jewish, who was a professor who was on the run from Franco. So he knew that, I just mentioned that because he knew that giving visas to people would get him in trouble. But in any event, all these people are in Bordeaux, and they're going door to door seeking exit visas because in order to get out of France, and again, the clock was ticking because the German army was bearing down, and everyone knew that the French would capitulate shortly. They were going door to door, and nobody would give them a visa, including the American embassy. And the rumor went around that the Portuguese diplomat might be sympathetic. So, this crowd started forming outside his consulate, and he came down and he found actually a young rabbi who had a very large family. As I mentioned, he had 14 children, and he said to the rabbi, "Why don't you come in with your kids? My consulate is empty. I have plenty of room. Why don't you stay the night? You shouldn't be sleeping on the street." And so he came in, and then Sousa Mendes had this very long conversation with him where he talked about how he thought he was possibly a descendant of conversos, and he asked him about, his family. And at the end of the night, he said to the rabbi, he said, "I think I can give you visas for your family." And the rabbi said, "I couldn't take the visas because what would happen to all my other fellow Jews out on the street and all the other refugees?" And he kind of declined the visas, at which point Sousa Mendes had what I saw the letter he wrote to his brother he described as a nervous breakdown. He took to his bed, and he was really tormented by this. And then he got up in very dramatic fashion. And there's many eyewitnesses to this, so I actually believe he actually did say this. He got up and he said, first he said to his family, "I would rather stand with God against man than with man against God." And then he went down and he said very dramatically, "I'm going to give a visa to every person who needs one, regardless of religion or background." And then he did that. And so he went on this visa writing spree for 3 weeks. And at one point, the word got back actually to Salazar because a woman came in for a tourist visa who was British, and they asked her to if she could wait for a few minutes because it was such a chaotic scene, and she got very offended and stormed out. And she went to the British consulate to complain, and they duly cabled Lisbon, and so he was aware that this was going on. They actually literally sent by limousine the ambassador from Portugal to Spain across the border to try to catch him. He was then running it was like a cat and mouse game all over the south of France. He was writing visas. And then, and during that time, among the people that he wrote visas for I opened the book with the rescue of the people who wrote Curious George, who were carrying the manuscript with them, Salvador Dali, the Habsburg family, including Otto von Habsburg, who was mentioned in Mein Kampf. They had the Hitler sent paratroopers to try to kill the Habsburg family, the Rothschild family, Paul Rosenberg, who was Picasso and Matisse's art dealer, but mostly just very poor Jews who were on the run. And then the door slammed shut when Vichy capitulated. And then Sousa Mendes was summoned back to Lisbon, and they opened up an investigation against him for disobeying orders. And the initial report, which I read, said that he had been, overtaken by his humanitarian impulse and he should be reprimanded, but that was it. the foreign minister then said, no, he should be basically demoted. And then Salazar personally got involved and said, no, he's fired and he loses his pension. And he basically wasn't even able to work anymore. And the next few years watched him have this very slow, sad decline where he had grown up, as an aristocrat. It was one of the reasons I think Salazar resented him, because he was from the same part of Portugal. He went through his entire life savings. His wife died. He had a stroke. His children could not get jobs. And he ended up having this very sad end. At the same time, and he was still alive when this happened, Salazar was, again, very Machiavellian. And at the end of the war, he switched sides. It did not stop him from being only one of two heads of state to send condolences to Germany when Hitler committed suicide. But he did successfully move to the Allied side when he saw the handwriting on the wall. He allowed the Allies to use the Azores as a landing base. And then after the war, he was one of the founding members of NATO. And part of the way that they were able to convince the West that this dictatorship was okay was because he said, look at all of the refugees we helped, which to some degree at the end of the war is true, but a lot of it was based on what Sousa Mendes had done. And this was beyond, as you can imagine, infuriating and upsetting to Sousa Mendes, who had basically, not only was he punished by Salazar, he was shunned by the entire diplomatic corps. His friends wouldn't speak to him. His children, again, had to leave the country. So that, and until Salazar, the Carnation Revolution in 1974, he and then his family, after he died, kept trying to get his case reopened. They wouldn't do it. Israel recognized him fairly early on as righteous, and then the United States in the 80s. But it wasn't until the 90s that he was finally rehabilitated, and now he's a national hero in Portugal. So there's something really wonderful about his humanity and this kindness that he showed. And he talked about afterwards. He said, actually, I'm a testament to the hospitality and the kindness of Portugal. Which was true. I mean, he was applauded in the streets when he did this, and this was someone who had been beloved as an emissary of Portugal. And so he could not understand why he was being punished for doing something that he thought would reflected well on the country. But there's something really, and then, to save 10,000 people, and it may be more, if you think about it, there's hundreds of thousands of people alive today because of him. Because, this is the statement from the Talmud on the medal that they give to the righteous: he who saves one life saves the world. It's because these people all had descendants, right? And some of these were, as I mentioned, famous, accomplished people that he saved, but there were many, many people. So his gift to the world continues to down through the generations.
Yeah, his nobility of spirit is fantastic and shines through your book. I think it's worthwhile pointing out that the other country, or at least the other head of state who sent condolences on the death of Hitler, was Eamon de Valera, the president of Ireland, neutral Ireland. Why was it that some communities such as Denmark and Albania, and tell us about Le Chambon, managed to rescue almost their entire Jewish populations, whereas others actually gave theirs up in an active way?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question in my view, because it has so much relevance to today. So, as you mentioned, there were, the most famous example is Denmark, where 95+% of the Jews survived. Albania, which was a majority Muslim country, but where all three monotheistic religions had lived for centuries, had more Jews at the end of the war than at the beginning of the war. And you mentioned Le Chambon, which is a fascinating story to me. This was a Protestant town in the plateau in the mountainous region in the south of France, where they had a long history of persecution themselves because they were the descendants of Huguenots. But they were the pastor there, André Trochme, and his wife Magda were very major figures in the nonviolent movement. They were also quite cosmopolitan, and basically they ended up in this very remote area because he couldn't get a job because of his pacifism. Wasn't afraid to risk his life. He actually volunteered to be an ambulance driver, but didn't believe in nonviolence. What's remarkable about that area is right next door was Klaus Barbie and some of the worst, violence against, and the resistance fighting. And Camus was there. That town ended up it wasn't really, it was actually just an entire region, ended up saving about 5,000 people, including 3,500 children. The children went to school there. They were treated, it was as if they were in camp. There was basically no evidence of denunciations. There was one roundup that happened where Chokme's young cousin was actually, he was like a housemaster. He ended up, there were about 15 kids and him who were actually deported east and murdered. But this was a very unusual situation where, and it was kind of an open secret, which is sort of, gets to your question, I think, why is it that they were able to do this? And I think what was unique about what was common with these places, and there were other pockets throughout Europe, is a few things. One is the entire community, well, they generally did not have a belief in religious bigotry. It was something anathema to them. It had been actually illegal. It had been banned in Denmark several hundred years before. But they also, and in Albania, there was a culture of hospitality where they would rather somebody die than who's a guest. They'd rather die than have a guest in their home or their country be hurt. And so that, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, a belief in something bigger than yourself. But, these were places that, over the temple in Les Chambon, it said, love thy neighbor, right? So they had the ethos to begin with. And then they really did not believe, that, like in Denmark, they viewed the Jews that were there as their neighbors and their friends and their fellow countrymen. So they were Danes first and Jews second. And there's an apocryphal story that the king of Denmark wore a Star of David, as many Jews were forced to do in Europe at the time, in solidarity. But he didn't, because from the beginning, the Danes refused to allow the Nazis to have any of the Jews wear a Star of David. They would not permit it. And what's interesting about these places, right, is that everybody stood together. During the war, the fascist party in Denmark, under occupation, received consistently less than 2% of the vote. This is while the Nazis were occupying the country. And as soon as they got there, the Wehrmacht and the Navy in particular, they knew this was not something they wanted. They did not want to be dealing with rounding up Jews because they knew that the Danes would be very upset about it. And that was there from the beginning. And so even when the SS came, the advice back to Germany was, don't do this, you're going to cause a problem. We're going to have an uprising. And so the Nazis knew that, and they didn't want to, nobody on the ground wanted to deal with that. And it ended up being that Hitler personally had to order the roundup of the Danish Jews. And then there was a tip-off from a Nazi who was a Nazi but not an anti-Semite, who tipped off. He worked as an advisor to the government. He then tipped off the Danish government, and Denmark then tipped off the Jewish community. And then in sort of an amateur flotilla, like in Dunkirk, over several weeks, they ferried almost the entire Jewish community to Sweden. The ones that were captured and sent to Theresienstadt, they continued to check on them. And so only 50 died of disease. When they came back also, it's important to note that they were welcomed back with open arms. Their plants had been watered. Their pets had been fed. Because in a lot of places, people took advantage of the Jews and they came back and you find someone living in your house. And I think that what the lesson to me that is interesting is that when you had the entire community stand up, and you're talking about in Les Chambon, these were nonviolent people, right? But you had the entire community stand up. You were able to really stand up to the Nazis. And by the way, in Denmark, it turned out that the advice to Hitler was correct, because later, this was one of the precipitating events to what a number of months later became a full-blown uprising by the Danes against the Nazis. And so I think what the other important lesson for me is, which goes again to the importance of with children, is I think if you can, which is why I think the anti-bullying campaign that people make fun of is actually pretty important, because if you can create any kind of community where more than half of the people will cut off hate in its midst, say, well, this is not what we stand for. These people prove that you can even stand up to the Nazis, even if you're unarmed. And in a lot of places for the Nazis, it was like pushing on an open door, where not only did people not object to the treatment of Jews and Roma and other people, they actually were the first people to run and collaborate and take advantage of it. But in the places where they actually didn't do that, it showed that it became more of an issue for the Nazis, and you could prevent it from happening.
You've mentioned that there's not that much interest in terms of history or academic study on this subject of rescue. Very little focus on it. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a few reasons. I think first of all, in the period right after the war, there was the one reason I'm moderately sympathetic to at the beginning was that the first generation of survivors felt that given how rare rescue was, and given that many of those people ended up surviving camps and had not been rescued, that they were concerned that we not distort the record. Although I will say from its beginning, Yad Vashem has as one of its core missions to honor the righteous. And at the dedication of the Garden of the Righteous, Golda Meir, who at the time was foreign minister, said, she had a very poetic statement where she said the rescuers were like drops of love in an ocean of poison, and the Jewish people in the state of Israel will remember them forever and always. But again, one out of, as I mentioned, the basketball stadium, analogy is very rare. So there was a concern not to distort the record. I think part of it, though, also was in the beginning, again, the rescuers themselves were very reticent to come forward. Many of them had very difficult lives after the war, and there was a lot of resentment towards them. So just because the Allies won the war didn't mean you solved the issue of anti-Semitism in Europe. So many of them came back, and people were quite angry at them. Why did you do this? You could have put us at risk. Oskar Schindler famously had rocks thrown at him in Germany. Behind the Iron Curtain, many stories disappeared until after the Berlin Wall fell, because it was quite dangerous to have been a rescuer, because there was an implication that you were working with the underground and you were therefore anti-communist and you were suspect. And so Lorena Sendler, who I mentioned, like her children could not go to university. And so there were many people over there that had the medal in the drawer. And that's important because the real killing fields of the Holocaust were in the east of Europe. And consequently, more Jews died in Poland than anywhere else. There were also more rescuers because there was more opportunity for rescue. So many of those stories did not come out until later. And many rescuers people didn't know who had rescued them, because, if you think about it, like the Sousa Mendes story, you may have met him for 5 minutes. He stamped your visa. You remember this like amazing person who saved your life, but you don't know who he was. And then he was not put forward. There was no press coverage or heroism about him later. So I think a lot of these stories just got lost. And then there was this effort sort of 20, 30 years after the war, led by a lot of people like my friend Abe Foxman, who had been rescued as children, to start to say, we really need to understand these people, and we really need to celebrate them and honor them and learn from them. But, again, I think rightfully the amount of books and scholarship that's done on the Holocaust and World War II in general will always dwarf rescue, because rescue was a small part of it. And in fact, part of the lesson is, why was it such a small part of it? Why did so few people do this? And so I think, that's part of it. And I do think there just is a part of us that, people tend to gravitate towards the bad. They gravitate towards evil. There's a fascination with it. And there's not such a fascination either in history or in the news with people who are heroic or who do amazing things. And I think we need to work harder to counter that narrative.
This book's full of amazing stories. What's your favorite one?
My favorite. Well, again, I think my favorite is probably Gino Bartali, who it was just because this is the story of
the
a man.
cyclist.
Yeah, so he was
cyclist,
possibly the most famous athlete in Europe, definitely in Italy at the time. And so it was this wild story about this very famous celebrity who ended up rescuing 700 people. The story basically, so he won the Tour de France in 1938, should have been a national hero, because Mussolini was obsessed with athletics and presented himself as a sportsman. But at that time, it was a big focus for the government, and they were on a winning streak. They had won the World Cup. They had done very well at the Olympic Games in Los Angeles, and Primo Carnera was the heavyweight champion of the world. Everybody dedicated their victory to Mussolini and the regime, except Gino Bartali. Gino Bartali was a devout Catholic, and he won the Tour de France in 1938, and he did not thank the regime. He dedicated his victory to Mary, and he thanked his fans. When he came back on the train to Italy, nobody greeted him at the station because Mussolini was livid. And the interesting thing about him is he was so famous, there really wasn't much they could do to him. And the church was the only real counterbalance to the fascist regime. But he sort of, had taken this stand. And then the war broke out, and he actually was recruited and he was drafted, but he was put to work as a messenger, and he was allowed to use his bicycle so he could stay in shape. But again, it's hard to put into perspective because cycling isn't it was like the peak of cycling, and in Italy of all places, it was enormous. So this was the equivalent of, like, in the United States today, like LeBron James. He was that kind of celebrity, and he was beloved. And so he worked as a bike messenger. But then during the war, so after the Allies came up in 1943, and the Allied forces came up right below Rome, and the fighting bogged down there. That's when it became very dangerous for Jews, because the Italians sort of viewed what they called the German disease, the anti-Semitism to the point of wanting to murder Jews, as kind of crazy. So actually, anywhere you were in Europe where the Italians were the occupying force, they did not do roundups. In fact, a friend of mine who was the head of the group at the Yad Vashem that gives out the reward for righteous, he had been rescued he had been saved as a child because he happened to be in the one small part of France that was occupied by the Italians. So they had discriminatory laws, but they didn't do roundups. But after 1943, and after, there was a brief moment where the Italians basically surrendered, but then the Germans came down, put Mussolini back into sort of a puppet regime in the north, and occupied the north of Italy. So from below Rome on up, that became very dire for the Jews of Italy, both the Italian Jews and the foreign Jews that were living there. And so there had been before that, you'd been able to get out. There was an underground group that would take people out, and it was sort of coordinated partly with the Catholic Church. Now the Jews had to go underground, and it's not that well known, but a big part of the Catholic Church in the north undertook this sort of underground operation, and one of the main figures, who was a pope, almost the pope, he was the Cardinal of Florence, and at the conclave when Pius XII was made pope, who did not distinguish himself with respect to the Holocaust. One of the other contenders was Cardinal Della Costa, who you could think about, like, if he had become pope, what would have happened? He was later became he's made also righteous among the nations. He was one of the ringleaders of this underground network, which hid Jews and partisans in monasteries and convents and the cloisters. And as we talked about earlier, fake papers were critical to this. And so what Bartali did, Gino Bartali, is he was recruited in by his priest, who was the cardinal, because he was so famous. His priest was the Cardinal of Florence, where he was from. He rode all around with the papers hidden in his bicycle. And what was interesting is, like, if he was stopped he was the only person who probably had a legitimate excuse for riding all over the north of Italy, and who also could physically ride from Florence to Genova in one day. And if they stopped him, he would say things like, don't touch my bike. It's perfectly calibrated for the racing. So he had an excuse for people not to touch his bicycle. And he performed this very heroic service as a courier for the underground, bringing false papers. And it centered on Assisi, which is where the underground even allowed Jews into the cloisters. The other thing he did was he had hid a family and some other people in an apartment he owned in Florence. During the occupation. This was very dangerous. If he had been caught, he would have been killed. He was actually at one point hauled in and interrogated, which his son said was the most terrifying moment of his life. So he ended up, they estimate, this as part of this underground, saving 700 people. This never told anyone. There were rumors. He did tell his son. His son actually said to him, "Why are you telling me this if I can't tell you?" And he said, "One day you'll know." And there were periodic rumors, and then later there was a book and a movie where he was mentioned. He got very upset. He wanted to sue them. He remained a very famous person in Italy. He became a commentator. And I've even seen footage of his 80th birthday party where this came up. He also saved a bunch of British soldiers. And he said, "I don't want to talk about it because when you do something good and you talk about it, you take away from it. You take away because you're profiting from someone else's misery." And he also said, "I want to be remembered as a cyclist." He said, "There's some medals you win in this lifetime, and they go in your trophy case. So there are other medals you get in the hereafter, and they're pinned to your soul, which I thought was a very beautiful thing to say. But it's also remarkable to me that this man who was such a famous person and had such a platform, and people pushed him to talk, he just refused to talk about it. And he really had this kind of genuine feeling that he didn't do anything unusual. He just followed his moral compass. He followed the teachings of his church. And so and I think, like, his separate, like, there's a whole story about him where, like, in 1948 he went back and won the Tour de France, and this was when Italy was almost going to have a civil war between the communists and the Christian Democrats, and things were very political. And he won the Tour de France, and at that point, by the way, they had just tried to assassinate the head of the Communist Party, and there was violence. And when the announcement of him winning the Chamber of Deputies, which is the sort of Italian Congress, they all got up as one and gave a standing ovation. So they used to say, Gino Bartali saved Italy, and he said, "I don't think I saved my country, but I gave it back its smile." So he had this wonderful modesty as well. But again, his story did not come out until after he died, and it came out later. And now he's a well-known figure in Italy.
Are there any rescuers today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had a very interesting 2-hour conversation with a man whose name I will endeavor not to mispronounce, Paul Rusesabagina, who, if you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, he saved 1,600 people who were basically holed up in the hotel. He could have been a person out of my book. Every single part of the profile made sense. It was completely not in his interest to do this. He risked his life, and he did that. So I think there've been 40 genocides since World War II. There's always rescuers. There were, I personally witnessed many people rescuing people out of Afghanistan in that horrible scene a couple of years ago. So yes, this does continue. People ask, what's happened with October 7th. It is a little troubling. I believe there will be stories, but actually with the hostages coming back, there are very few stories or even anecdotes of people doing anything like this. But on the day of October 7th, there were people who tried to save Jews. There were Bedouins. There were Muslim Israelis there was one man who was killed doing it. I mean, there were more than one, but the stories, and Israel has already recognized them and awarded them with, honored them, the ones who survived and the ones who died. So yes, I think there do continue to be rescuers, and I think it's important to tell those stories.
Yeah, there was a Bedouin security guard who I met who saved dozens of Jews at the Nova Festival. I think it was very interesting what you said earlier about how they say, I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did what a normal person would do. Actually, of course, they were not doing what a normal person would do. Normal people are cowards, and under these circumstances, or not so much cowards, but they have family, they have people who they recognize would be oppressed as a result of them being brave. It's truly remarkable, isn't it? These stories. You have 10 chapters of 10 different areas, including some ones that we don't have time to talk about, such as Princess Alice of Greece, and the 10 POWs, British POWs saving a teenage girl from the death marches. It really is a fantastic book, and many congratulations on it. What book are you reading at the moment? What history book or biography have you got on your bedside table?
I feel like I'm always reading a few books, but one I'm in the middle of right now is called Proto, by a historian named Laura Spinney, which is the story of Proto-Indo-European, and which is the language that almost all European languages and all Indian languages come from. I feel like I get into sort of, my son has gotten me interested in this topic, and I had just read a book called The Mesopotamian Riddle, which is the decipherment of cuneiform, which was it took place in Victorian England, and it's one of these like wonderful stories of the intellectual decipherment at the same time as archaeology, and then you get involved with the kind of ancient history, which I love. And I'm about to start a biography of Gauguin that just came out.
Who's that by? Can you remember the author?
It's gotten a lot of attention, and I will tell you, it is by. I'm traveling, so it's not on my.
Not to worry.
It's Wild Thing. So it's by Sue Prideaux.
Good. That's good to know.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes.
And what about your what if, your counterfactual?
Yeah. So I love counterfactuals, and the one I always gravitate to is which I really do believe, and I do believe in this sort of, I think it's misnomer to talk about the great man history, but I think different people in different. So Churchill, May 1940. I do believe if he was not there, the world would have gone in a very different direction. And World War II was obviously completely full of counterfactuals. I was thinking not to do that one. Another book I just finished, which is coming out shortly, is my friend Barry Strauss's book on Jews versus Rome.
Hey, he's been on the show.
There you go. Well, he's another Hoover guy.
Recently.
So he has a very good book coming out, and I always wonder, the destruction of the temple in 70, was this avoidable? For sure, it was avoidable. And I was thinking, you go back, because my degree is in ancient history, if Caesar hadn't been assassinated, but I actually think the moment was actually. But this is a little too wonky. If Claudius's son Britannicus hadn't been poisoned, which opened the way for Nero to be emperor, this would have been it. But to answer your question, I will give you one that's very on point for this conversation, which is Herbert Hoover, the namesake of the Hoover Institute, was very different than FDR on the Holocaust. And he actually, from the moment after FDR won the election in 1932, Hitler became chancellor. And in the period during the transition, and Hoover and FDR were both asked to protest the treatment of the Jews, and Hoover immediately did it. And then FDR, when he came in, countermanded it and said, that's not our problem. And then later, because again, you always have to say, well, when did people know things? But when we really knew what was going on, Herbert Hoover was extraordinarily outspoken. He was like Churchill that way, but he was one of the very few people of international stature who openly spoke out against the Holocaust, including in 1942, 43. He staged there was a pageant that was staged that he personally sponsored. I mean, I wrote an article about this for the Journal, but because he's unfairly treated by history, because he's known for presiding over the Great Depression. But in fact, he had made his name originally because he saved probably more people than anyone in the history of the world from hunger after World War I as a volunteer. He had organized
in Belgium in particular, wasn't it?
He started in Belgium, but then it was all of Europe, yes. And he did that as a volunteer. He was a businessman, and that's what propelled him on his career. So I question, if FDR had not been president and Herbert Hoover had been president during the Holocaust, I think it might have gone in a different direction. Certainly the United States would have been much more welcoming of refugees. Certainly we would have done things like bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz, and all of those things at the margin that the West didn't do, that emboldened the Nazis to undertake the final solution, but also could have dramatically mitigated it. I think he would have done. And so that's a very, it's an interesting question, because, who occupies the Oval Office at any given time today is a crucial question. And these things are very personal. These people have a lot of power. I mean, I did not talk about in my book, I wanted to talk about people who are on the ground, but I do think people who have a platform, either political or in another way, have a responsibility to speak out. And it's a very long conversation about the United States and FDR and all of that. But again, the same way I think Churchill was a critical figure, and Churchill, to me, distinguished himself as basically a righteous among the nations from where his seat was. I think Hoover should be recognized for that as well. So it's an interesting counterfactual in terms of the Holocaust. Like, if Hoover had been president instead of FDR, what would have been different? I think it would have been better.
Richard Hurowitz, author of In the Garden of the Righteous, The Heroes Who Risked Their Lives to Save Jews During the Holocaust. Thank you very much indeed for coming on Secrets of Statecraft.
Thank you for having me.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.